Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Yamarino, and today we're going to be talking about Yahweh and his true first prophet. So, as always, something controversial. We're going to be looking at two options today, Moses or Jethro. Odds are you've heard of Moses, and possibly you've heard of Jethro as well. But if you haven't, then you're really going to want to stay tuned because it's a pretty interesting tale. In order to dive into who's the true prophet, though, we have to look at Yahweh first and spend about a third of this video talking about the origins of Yahweh, the attributes of Yahweh. And then we'll transition and sort of look at the case for whether Moses or Jethro should earn this title of the first true prophet of Yahweh. Now, when it comes to Yahweh, a good place to start is, all right, well, what does the name mean? It pretty much means he is. Or as the Bible will tell us, I am that I am, I will be what I will be. That doesn't really give us much of anything, but it's not too surprising because in the ancient world, it's very common to have a god not want to reveal their true name, even to their closest followers. And the reason for that is typically about power. In the Bible, in the Ten Commandments, right, we have this rule that you should not misuse God's name. It's not exactly clear what misuse consists of, but one thing for sure is utilizing a God's personal name for, say, magical reasons. Personal gain through magical means. And again, that's going to require knowing the God's true name, right? So we don't have much here when it comes to the name in terms of helping us out with origins. We're going to have to look at other things like more of what's in the text and in archaeology, right? Now, the texts pretty much tell us that this is a mountain god, a thunderstorm god, a war god, and described sometimes as like the rider on the clouds. Now, this particular title, say like the rider on the clouds, and this idea being associated with thunderstorms and war, it sounds reminiscent of an important neighboring god to the north, Baal. Right? So Baal is sort of a second tier, but really widely worshipped god in the Kenite pantheon. Above Baal, you would have the head of the pantheon, and that's going to be El. Right? Now, El is all over the place, literally. Place names, think about like Israel, right? Has El in it. Or personal names, Gabriel, Michael, right? Names that we still have that are commonplace today. Right? It goes to show just how far that God and that God's sort of reach has made it into even the 21st century. Right? Now, as the Bible will sort of explain though, Yahweh sort of merges and subsumes the attributes of both Baal, which was easy because they're very similar. Kind of, again, storm type gods, war gods, stuff like that. But it was a little bit more difficult to try to merge Yahweh's attributes with El, because El is more sort of benevolent, merciful, and not quite as intense as some of his first offspring, both male and female, are, who can be much more violent and aggressive. But you kind of get that in the Bible. When you think about Yahweh, you sort of have these like two pillars, right? Or two paths, the more merciful and then the more, wrathful of sorts that you find throughout the Hebrew Bible. Right? Now, what can we get from the archaeology? What does that really tell us? Because if you look at the text early on, sort of pre-biblical texts, we have a good amount of material from the north and really the Kenite pantheon with stuff like the Baal cycle and whatnot. But there's hardly any text further south. But that doesn't mean that there aren't smaller scale examples from the archaeological record. One of the most important is the Kenite Ajrud inscriptions on these pithoi, these sort of like large jugs that are broken into many pieces, and archaeologists managed to, reconstruct them. And there were also wall inscriptions. It's a fascinating site in northeastern Mount Sinai, right? And that's going to really be the region. If we ask ourselves, like, well, where does Yahweh actually start? What's the geography here? It's probably that we're looking at like Mount Sinai on the far western region to really more of like northwestern Saudi Arabia, and then the southern part of the Dead Sea, like south of that, where you'd have like Edom and right, the Edomites and the mountainous desert region in that whole zone. Trying to narrow it down more specifically, scholars of course have tried to do this, whether you're talking about Sinai or Horeb or all these different mountains. I think, the odds are that I don't think Yahweh is really associated with just one mountain of God. It's likely that he's associated with sort of multiple mountains or mountain range. Seems more plausible. But again, exactly where, difficult to say. But in these Kenite Ajrud inscriptions from the 9th and 8th century BCE, you have a pretty interesting visual representation of Yahweh, which is unique. And he's not alone. He's with his female consort, his Asherah. Also very common in the ancient world to have a female consort, whether it's in Egypt or Mesopotamia or Canaanite pantheon, it doesn't much matter. In these polytheistic situations, you typically have this particular male god and then their female partner, right? So that's not too shocking. I will have a separate video for those interested on the Asherah whole concept and whether or not it's referencing Yahweh's consort or something else. And then we will take a look again at that Kenite Ajrud inscriptions as well as many other things. But for now, we're sticking with Yahweh. Pretty bizarre look though, when you do see how he's portrayed in the Kenite Ajrud inscription. Now, there is another interesting example from archaeology from the Edomites who very well might have been worshiping Yahweh under the name of Kos or Kaus. It's quite possible that they're the same. They might not be though the same. They might have been worshiping both or one and then the other. But in the archaeological record, there is this intriguing, head that was found in that region where they had a sort of shrine. And I'd say that if you look, it bears some sort of resemblance to even this more primitive, scratched, if you will, drawing, simple drawing in the Kenite Ajrud inscription. Be that as it may, there's not a whole lot of material in the archaeological record. Partially that's just because of the fact that you're dealing with a vast area that's not easily accessible, certain parts of it even today, and groups of people that are primarily wandering and nomadic. So when you add all that together, it shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Right? Now, that takes us to this idea of the nomadic piece. Another key piece, though, of evidence coming from Egypt, in this case, right? The Egyptians, they're the main power in the larger region. However, with the Bronze Age collapse, you have a loss of Egyptian hegemony, and this creates, kind of leading into the third intermediate period of Egyptian history, a gap for newer gods to develop, or if they already were there, to start flourishing more. But still, even when Egypt's kind of knocked down, they're not fully out, and there's just a lot of wealth and knowledge and power emanating really from that region. And we have important inscriptions. One of those is going to be discussing the Shasu tribes, of which there are 6, I believe, that are mentioned. And one of them is the Shasu of Yahweh, which is presumed to be Yahweh. Okay? The Shasu basically mean like sort of brigands or plunderers, but also wanderers. So it's referencing these people that are to the east, basically, right, of Egypt, in the region I already described before, that are sort of wandering around. So again, not too shocking when you don't have a bunch of cities set up that you wouldn't have easily accessible archaeological record at this time. But we still find some things here and there. So the Egyptians, starting with around, I think it's Amenhotep III, Seti I, sort of Ramses II and III, in this whole stretch of time, you're going to have a few different descriptions of these groups, and Israel is even mentioned on the Merneptah stela. So that's an important, thread of evidence for trying to pin down both Yahweh and also like who are the Israelites and who are these Shasu tribes and how are they all connected. Right. What I'm sort of claiming in this video today, though, is that primitive Yahwism, or this early Yahweh cult, maybe we don't know exactly where it started, but it's most likely in this region of like northwestern Saudi Arabia, parts of Jordan by today's map, and Mount Sinai as well, kind of leading up to the southern part of Israel. Somewhere in there is where Yahweh is going to start and flourish, right? And then step by step, through a course of just wild events at times, prominence just rises in prominence, eventually becoming the national God of Israel, and then eventually, with more and more time, effectively just becoming God. So a fascinating story of, rising from very humble beginnings, if you will, to the ultimate height when it comes to what you could have for a God, right? You might even think too that, he's only worshipped eventually in like the temple, right? Like that's it. And there's no real idolatry and this aniconism that you have with, in Judah and all this, the southern kingdom and whatnot. But the reality is very clear that there was worship in the form of a bull, which that's not shocking because the bull is basically an important symbol, whether it's in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or anywhere else, or Greece, right, for an important male god. And in the northern part, as Yahweh kind of rises all the way north and into the northern kingdom, you have the Tel Dan shrine that we know of, where they had sort of bull imagery, still associated though with Yahweh. You have Tel Arad. You have these like high places on mountaintops, hilltops, where people would worship Yahweh. And they would have frequently imagery of, especially maybe even his consort, which again, I'll talk more about that in a separate video. Now, let's sort of shift gears though and get into our real question for today, which is really, who is the first prophet for Yahweh? Moses is the answer that is traditional. So with all of this stuff, you have to be careful because there's the biblical tradition and then there's archaeology and other texts, right? Other historical texts. And they do not always agree. In fact, they most often do not agree. However, there are some examples where there are some points of fascinating agreement. So I only say that because you're trying to weave together here when answering this question two pretty distinct narratives. But if we allow ourselves to let the tradition speak for a moment, we can look at Moses' sort of backstory real quickly. I bet a lot of people are familiar that Moses is born, we're in Egypt here now, right? That you've got these Hebrew people in bondage. Moses is born, and then quickly, he, after a few months, has to be hidden, and he's put down the Nile in a basket of reeds, or far more accurately in the Hebrew, he's put in a teva, which means ark, which basically tells you right out of the gate, this is a salvation story. Just like Noah was a salvation story for all of humanity, this is a salvation story geared towards, more specifically, the Hebrew people that are in bondage. Okay? Important example of how stuff is lost, right? In translation. So, anyhow, he's sent down, and then, you have the situation where Pharaoh's daughter, finds him and then raises him as effectively royalty and names him Moses because he's pulled out of the water. It's this attempt at trying to tie a connection to the Hebrew term for pulling out of water. The more likely case though here is that Moses is not a complete name. And this is sort of important to even our Yahweh story. His name means, and if we're talking about in Egypt, think about it. Ra Moses, like Ramses. Ah Moses, Tut Moses. Those are important names, royal names. But they have Moses in it because it's you're born of Ra, right? Or these other gods. If your name's just Moses, it's basically a half name. You're born of what? I don't know. A foreign god, right? Presumably, in this case. But if we stick with tradition, he is going through an Egyptian enculturation process. 100%, right? He knows what it is to be an Egyptian. That's pretty much all he knows, right? The story quickly just fast forwards to him being an adult. And then he's seeing these Hebrew slaves being mistreated, and he murders, pretty shocking, right? Murders a full-blooded Egyptian, which you can't do, right? That's a crime. It's one thing to murder a slave in this time period, something else, but to murder effectively a citizen, if you will, full-blooded like that, then you're in trouble. And so he runs away and he goes off into the wilderness, and that's where our story hits for this. He ends up in Midian, which is out in the Sinai, or again beyond the Gulf of Aqaba into more northwestern Saudi Arabia by today's maps. He's somewhere around there, okay? We don't know exactly where. And he runs into Zipporah, he runs into, basically, there are women at a well, they're fighting with different herdsmen. He helps sort it out, and he gets brought to dinner, and he meets Jethro, who's our other rival here for being the true first prophet, okay, of Yahweh. And Jethro's very kind, very, thanks him for helping out with the situation, offers his daughter to be Moses' wife, and he accepts, and they eventually have 2 children. And he's there for a very long time. Moses is. Very, very long time. As a shepherd and just sort of living his life, basically, in exile. Now, it's critical to note that Moses is basically kind of working for or working with Jethro. Jethro is first introduced as a priest, which is key, of Midian. Because if Yahweh is originally from this region, right? I mean, okay, Jethro, or Reuel, another name for him, is described as the priest, right, in this region. So that's pretty interesting in and of itself, right? Anyhow, as time goes on, the next part of the story, we all know that Moses is going to go and he's going to have his episode with the burning bush and these revelations from God that are going to tell him that he needs to go back and free the people in Egypt, right? So it seems that the story is now kind of shifting back to like, okay, well, no, Moses, right? Moses is the center here of this story. This other guy's more of just a peripheral character, Jethro, right? So we stick with Moses. He goes back and he does free the people, right? And fast forward, then he's moved out with the people, left Egypt, and we have a wildly large number of people that are supposedly with him that's totally not historically accurate. I mean, you'd be looking at like, from the book of Numbers and stuff, you'd be looking at like 1 million people if you bring like women and children in there. It's just totally implausible that many people were there in one part of Egypt at this one time. And that's like the population of Rome, near its height. It's just not the case. It's all part of this like literary tool of kind of like exaggeration that you find in many places in the Bible. So anyhow, Moses has this group, okay? They're kind of functioning as religious free agents when you think about it, because these people, even if they're Hebrews, and even if we're to believe that somehow they're worshiping, they already have their God, and it's El Shaddai, or it's actually been Yahweh, or whatever it is we're supposed to believe at this time in the story, the fact remains they're in Egypt and they're surrounded by Egyptian imagery the whole time, right? Now, when Moses is sort of wandering about at one period, right, with the Hebrew people, and they're kind of stuck wandering, what happens? They stop believing. They're always having issues like, well, why do we follow this guy out into the desert, and stuff like that, only to be to basically die of hunger and thirst and whatnot. And they're being afflicted by sort of fiery snakes. And there's this interesting episode in Numbers 21, I believe, 4-9, where you have the bronze serpent episode, where Moses is going to make this, on a huge pole, this bronze serpent that effectively cures the people of these different ailments. Now, I bring this up only because, okay, we're supposed to be talking about Yahweh here, but this sounds like this is exactly an Egyptian answer to a problem. You're essentially dealing with sort of sympathetic type magic or something like that, where you have in Egypt the Urias symbol. I'll bring it up here. The eyes of Ra, right? Stuff like this. Constantly you'd see this image of like a red or glowing sun disk with wings, with snake serpents right underneath it as a protection entrance to buildings and archways. And it's all over the place in Egyptian imagery. And we don't know exactly what this bronze serpent looked like, but it seems like it probably was something like that. And why not? The people are complaining, and that's basically a symbol that they're probably very familiar with, and Moses would also be very familiar with. And if you want further proof of this, fast forward way down the timeline to King Hezekiah, and we have examples of his sort of seal, this bulla, and I'll bring that up here. it has onks and this whole thing still. I mean, it's very Egyptian. Now, granted, because there's always back and forth political stuff between sort of Israel and Egypt and whatnot. But still, like, that's very Egyptian looking. Maybe because they are still keeping this bronze serpent that Moses made in the temple, to which Josiah is going to, during his radical period of reforms, destroy these things. So that just goes to show an example, though, of how I think, like, culturally Egyptian these people were that Moses is with, right? Who knows exactly what they actually, believed in terms of, like, personal worship and prayer, but that's a fairly kind of, like, intriguing and telling, episode there, right? Now, regardless of all that, we need to get to Jethro, right? So Moses, if we go to Exodus 18 and look at Exodus 18, 10 through 12, I can bring this up and read this quote. What's going to happen is Moses is going to meet with Jethro after he's freed the people from Egypt at sort of the mountain of God. Now, obviously Jethro knows where all this is. He's sort of from this area, and it's pretty fascinating what occurs when, Aaron, Moses, all these people meet Jethro here. So I'll read this quote from Exodus 18, 10 through 12. Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you from the Egyptians and Pharaoh. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he delivered the people from the Egyptians when they dealt arrogantly with them." And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. Let's stop there. Why on earth would this guy, Jethro, be performing these priestly activities? Granted, he's described as a priest, right? But the more traditional narrative here is that, like, Moses knows about Yahweh kind of thing, and Jethro is, like, converting here to this early cult of Yahweh, basically. But that doesn't really seem to make a lick of sense, because you're going to let some guy who just found out about this kind of and converted provide all these offerings. He knows exactly how to do it. We worship this God the exact same way, whatever he was doing before. It doesn't really add up at all. It makes a lot more sense that Jethro was the priest already of Yahweh, is the most proficient and familiar in how to propitiate this God and to, give thanks to this God and all that. And so they let him do it, right? Moses, Aaron, the elders, whatever, they all let him do it. In fact, maybe they're learning how to even do it, right? From him. And that would be kind of my argument, is that it seems more like Jethro is sort of the master here, right? Who holds the knowledge of how to properly worship Yahweh, and he has been maybe training Moses over the years as almost like an assistant who might take his place with time, right? And a prophet, maybe he accepts too, right? That Moses is a prophet. That's fine too, in his own right. But more of like a successor, if you will, rather than founder. Now, if we need more proof, which we do, because that's just one quote, certainly insufficient, the very next episode, right after this, in Exodus 18, strange, because you have Moses trying to delegate the law to all the people that are there. All the people are coming with their complaints. Imagine that, right? It almost seems like scene in like Godfather, something, right? Everyone's coming in at the beginning and like, hey, I need this, help me, type of thing, and trying to seek justice in some way. And it's not practical for Moses to hear everyone's complaints in this large group. Imagine if we were to believe the numbers too that supposedly are with him. It's totally illogical and impractical. Jethro sees this and he's like, what are you doing? you need to delegate the law and sort of the courts, if you will, or like almost a court of law, to various elders who will take a certain percentage of the people and their problems, because you've got other stuff that you need to be doing, type of thing. And they accept it. They're like, basically, great idea. So are we really to accept now that this guy who tradition's now trying to tell us is like a recent convert or something is an expert in how to worship Yahweh, okay? And also an expert in how to distribute the law associated also with Yahweh. And Moses, Aaron, again, the elders, just like, yeah, we whatever you say sounds good. That's crazy to me, sounding that would possibly be the case. It seems far more probable that it's because Jethro already, again, has the deep background in Yahweh and how to worship Yahweh, how to deal with Yahweh's laws, and all that, right? Now, if we want, that's kind of all we've got. There's really not too much else. There are other mentions of him and how, again, the Hebrew people and stuff, like they're going to go up north with them, and they're always kind of like on the periphery, this group, the Kenites, as they're going to be called. So a lot of this is the Kenite hypothesis, if you want to look up more of it. This idea that sort of Yahweh sort of starts and, earlier on before Moses, and one person we know for sure that's associated with this primitive form of Yahwism is Jethro, type of thing. And that Jethro basically teaches Moses to a certain extent the ways, right, of how to deal with this God, right? So remember, this isn't an easy God to probably deal with. We're talking about a mountain god, tribal, storm god, war god. Violence is without a doubt in God's nature. Look how many times in the Hebrew Bible someone has to, an important figure, right? Whether it's Abraham or whatever else, has to like step in and try to mellow whoever is the top god, try to like mellow them out, right? From killing a bunch of people or a whole city. So you need to know what you're doing, and you need to not make a mistake in how you're to perform the rites. I mean, it's so critical that even Aaron, who eventually will be responsible for this, right, in the priesthood, his kids, dead. Boom. Like that fast, right? Just shot down for bringing in foreign fire, or however you translate that cryptic term in Hebrew. So you need to know what you're doing. I think that's another great example too of like, if you look at that episode with Aaron and his kids, when they're knocked down for bringing in foreign fire, which who knows exactly what that means. It's probably because in order to make a sacred fire, like in other religions like Zoroastrianism and stuff, you need to have all these elements that are brought together from different people, different types of people, and even lightning that's come down from God, and all needs to be brought together to make a sacred fire type of thing. Who knows exactly what it meant, or if they brought some sort of incense, it's the wrong thing. But that's the point. It doesn't seem like it was something too major, and they're killed for doing it. Yet Jethro provided all these sacrifices and doesn't know anything about it, and God's pleased, and doesn't take him out, sort of thing. it doesn't really seem like that adds up in many ways, right? So there you have it. Make of that what you will. As far as who is the first true prophet, my answer, I'm fine with saying it, is without a doubt on the side of Jethro being the answer. And who knows, maybe there's people before him, right? But they're not in any record, so we wouldn't know. And it does seem that Jethro trains Moses to some extent in all of this, right? As time goes on. Their last fascinating piece to add to this, there's a religion that I bet a lot of people haven't heard of, the Druze religion. There's 800,000 to 1 million still today. Many of them are even living in Israel today. And they have as the founder of their religion and the most important prophet, Jethro. And that's who they claim kind of like connection to in their lineage. So here you have still a religion that's quite ancient, but still very active today. And you have Jethro. But they also accept Moses, see? But as Moses is being, like I'm kind of saying, or in this Kenite hypothesis, next in line or subsidiary or secondary, in some way, to Jethro. So pretty interesting. And I think to kind of wrap all this up, I've got another quote here, which we can kind of tie this all back to maybe looking at Yahweh for a second, because it is an interesting reference that's coming from Deuteronomy 33:2. And this is Moses speaking himself, sort of his final words in many ways, final speech. Moses said, "The Lord came from Sinai and shone forth from Seir to them," or Seir to them. "He appeared from Mount Paran and came with some of the holy myriads. From his right hand was a fiery law for them." Now, this phrase, even fiery law situation, is a literal one-off in the Hebrew. It's nowhere else, anywhere, in any sort of text ever. So it's unclear how to translate it. And many people, many scholars more recently have tried to state that there might be a different and perhaps better way of translating this, where it would read, "The Lord came from Sinai and shone forth from Seir to them. He appeared from Mount Paran and came to Meribeth Kadesh. From his right hand was his Asherah." So very possible that that's actually a translation that's been edited out, redacted, shifted in the Hebrew Bible. And I leave all of you with that because I think it gives us, it's put in Moses' mouth for one thing, right? This statement. And it shows the direction even, right? Coming even from Moses' mouth, that Yahweh's coming from the south and from these mountain ranges, basically. And maybe, highly controversial, but maybe, right? There's even an acceptance that he did not come north by himself, but came with his partner and his consort. So be on the lookout for that in the next episode. But until then, I'll leave it the way we always leave it. It's unclear whether Moses should get the credit in this case or Jethro. So probably best that we stay gray.